Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's WorkSafe Month webinar, Work-Related Alcohol and Drug Use, a Fit for Work Issue. I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania and also the coordinator of WorkSafe Tasmania Month. I'll also be your moderator for this afternoon's session. Before we do get started, there are just a few before we do get started, I'd appreciate you taking a few moments to read the following information about sessions delivered during WorkSafe Month. I'll now run over how you can interact in this afternoon's webinar. So we've taken a screenshot of the control panel of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer screen in the upper right corner. You're likely listening in using your computer's speaker system, I should say, by default. However, if you would prefer to join by phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll also have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing in your questions in the pane of the control panel. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We will collect them and address them during the presentation and also at the end. We are also recording today's webinars and webinars that we are running during WorkSafe Month. They will be progressively made available on the WorkSafe TAS website, so do have a look there after WorkSafe Month. And also lastly but not least, when you do leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey of the presentation, and we'd appreciate you providing us with your feedback and your comments before you do leave. Now to today's presenter. The program of events does state that we were meant to have Oliver Fearman from IPM Safety. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Oliver is not with us today. Instead, we have Gary Lebsant from IPM Safety. So I welcome Gary this afternoon to present today's webinar, Work-Related Alcohol and Drug Use, a Fit for Work Issue. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Steph, and good afternoon, everyone out there. I see we've got 21 people logged in, so that's a goodly number. And yes, my apologies for those of you who are expecting to hear from Oliver. He wasn't available today. He's actually at a training course himself. Those of us at IPM, we pride ourselves in keeping abreast of latest information in the work health and safety arena. So just a little bit about myself. I've spent 30 odd years in heavy industry, and over that time I've been in various situations associated with drugs and alcohol, not too many, thank goodness. I can remember a situation where I had to call out an electrician on the weekend sometime to fix a piece of plant, and he said, Gary, well, I certainly can come in, but I can't drive. I've been drinking a bit too much. So that was one interesting circumstance. I had another person who worked for me. After a while, I sort of found out he was on a rehab program, and I think the union official and I think the works HR officer had got together and suggested the guy talk to me and then work out what we're going to do going into the future. And the other aspects are the breath testing that I've experienced sort of going onto mine sites, especially here in Tasmania. Anyway, just a little bit about my background. So work-related alcohol and drug use. So as you can see on the screen here, these are the main topics today. What is fit for work? I'll go over that and then describe, give a definition for it. Fit for work, shared responsibility. It's quite a few people involved. And then the fit for work and the interaction with responsibilities under the law, under the Tasmanian law. And then cover the the effects of alcohol and drugs, and then the key principles of effective drug and alcohol risk management and programs that companies have these days. So fit for work. So the term fitness for work, as the word say, it effectively means that a person is fit physically and psychologically to enable them to perform their normal work tasks competently in a safe manner, which does not threaten their safety or health or well-being, or indeed that of others. So hence that's the crux of the matter, and how drugs and alcohol can affect a person's fitness for work. So a shared responsibility is obviously the worker, so the person who's theoretically affected in this discussion. So obviously there's we'll get into his or her duty of care in a little while, but fellow workers, they may well notice a difference in the workers' attributes, and so they have a responsibility to either speak up or aim to help him or her, or mention it to the supervisor. And I guess this is where teamwork comes into it. Obviously the supervisor, so the supervisor has responsibilities both to the worker and to the fellow workers, and so they have a responsibility to communicate with workers, to perhaps coach, mentor, and to work issues out with the workers, and even notice, once again, whether a worker's acting differently from one day to another. So the medical assessor, so the worker may go to a medical person for some help, and this is where the may get prescription medication prescribed to them. And so the medical assessor has a responsibility of explaining how different drugs, different medication can affect a person, all the different side effects. Certainly, you've probably all had examples of getting medicine and reading the blurb that comes with it, and there's all sorts of different side effects. So that's possible, and we're not all the same. Family and friends, so they have a responsibility as well, whether they, I guess, perhaps encourage a person to drink or take drugs, or perhaps a responsibility to talk them out of it, comment on their friends either helping them or supporting them. And certainly there's been ads on regular ads over the years about certainly about alcohol and the effect of drink driving. So that's the shared responsibility in this case. So fit for work. So the legal ramifications comes in under the duty of care. So duty of care refers to duties that the legislation places upon people to ensure their own safety at work and of others. And as you probably know, employers, employees, supervisors, virtually everybody on a work site has a particular duty of care under Tasmanian legislation. So this slide gives some more details. So you've got four duties of care. You've got the PCBU, which is the legal term for the employer. So the employer has the overall duty of care for everybody on site, so to take reasonably practicable steps to reduce risks, and in this case to take reasonable practical steps to check, to ensure, to help people be fit for work effectively, and that sort of leads into the next one. So officers' duty of care. So officers under legislation, they are the senior people within the organisation, the people who have major controls of budgets resources, setting up systems. So the officers are effectively putting in systems, setting up leadership, and also leading, if you like, teamwork, reinforcing teamwork, culture. That are all important aspects to work health and safety generally, and in this case, being whether people are fit for work. So it's called due diligence. So officers have to put systems in place to monitor, to reinforce, to support good safety systems, safety practices. And having a system in place in relation to testing or responding or performance managing is an important part of their legal duty of care. Workers' duty of care. So this is termed reasonable care. So all workers on site, and the term workers, so that covers employees as well as contractors, apprentices, even volunteers. So systems need to be in place to induct the workers in the first place, to train them so that they are made aware of what the company's expectations of them are. In this case, fit for work. They're expected to come to work in a fit state, and if not, actually acknowledge to their supervisors if they've got a problem. And we'll get, the next slide has a little bit more details on the workers and others, as they call it, duty of care, others being visitors and similar people. And they both have, it's called reasonable care in the legislation standard. So yeah, so duty of care, workers and others. So so legally, this is the requirement. So workers and other people at a workplace, they have to take responsible reasonable care of their own health and safety. So being self-aware of their fitness for work is where this connection comes in. They also have to take reasonable care that their conduct does not adversely affect others in the workplace, and also comply as he or she is reasonably able to do so with instructions. So instructions being, policies, procedures, as well as verbal instructions from supervisors and managers. And workers, as opposed to other people, may have to cooperate with reasonable notified policies or procedures. And other people in the workplace may not have such ready access to details about a company's policies or procedures, and hence that's why there's not a connection there between other persons at the workplace and the duty of care to cooperate with reasonable procedures. So just to summarize that again, so I started off with duty of care being a person's ability to be fit to do their work, and this is the legal requirements that workers have to follow, and ultimately officers, managers, and the employer must implement, follow to ensure work health and safety standards are continued to be met. So the effects of alcohol and drug use, and I'm guessing most of you probably have a pretty good understanding of these, but let me just go through a few of the details with you. So obviously a drug is any substance which is taken into the body and alters its function, as in the body's function, physically and or psychologically. So just a few definitions. So illicit drugs. So illicit drugs refers to illegal drugs, including heroin, cocaine, barbiturates, cannabis, and MDMA, So there's quite a range of illegal drugs, as you no doubt know. There's also non-medical use. So illicit drugs also covers non-medical use of pharmaceutical drugs, including painkillers, amphetamines, methadone, other opiates and steroids. And then lastly, the inappropriate use of volatile substances and other substances like ketamines and inhalants. So there's quite a wide range of what is regarded to be illicit drugs. Another definition, short-term risk drinking. So that's generally drinking at risk or high risk levels at least once in, so there's three groups. During the last 12 months is defined as occasional. In the last month is defined as infrequent. And in the last week is defined as frequent. When we get into discussing the effects of either alcohol or drugs. So workplace alcohol and illicit drug use refers to a wider definition that includes alcohol and or drugs consumed during work hours or immediately before commencing work. It also includes consumption that occurs outside of normal working hours that may be influenced by workplace culture, norms or expectations that could have an effect on the person's capacity to perform their work. So they're the main definitions that will come up during this afternoon's presentation. So prescription medication. So some people may well assume that the doctor gives them medications to take for some ailment, whether it be a cold or a flu or something else. But as I mentioned earlier, there can be an unexpected impact on their working ability. So I think once again this may be obvious, but let me cover it. So alcohol is a depressant drug. So it slows down activity in the central nervous system, including the brain. It affects concentration and coordination and slows the response time to unexpected situations, which could lead to risk-taking behaviour, incidents, falls, injury and death as consequences of the brain's reduced control over reaction time. After just 1 or 2 drinks, a person may feel more relaxed, but will also have slower reflexes. I think somewhere over time I've heard, I think they link a certain amount of % of alcohol in our system is effectively we're got the reflexes of a 70-year-old or an 80-year-old. It's one of the ways the doctors and the media have tried to get the message across to us. So as the person drinks more, they would continue to experience the acute health effect of alcohol use, which includes various things such as confusion, drowsiness, blurred vision, poor muscle control, gut irritation, diarrhea, and the list goes on. And I guess a lot of us see the, reminded of how long these alcohol stays in our system when the breathalyzer tests, particularly on the side of the road, maybe Sunday morning, or trying to test people whether they're driving after a hard night the night before. So effects of illicit drugs. So that will depend a lot on the type of drug use. So the most common illicit drugs consumed are cannabis, ecstasy, amphetamines and cocaine. So impaired coordination, affected thinking and memory, increased heart rate and low blood pressure are some of the effects of consuming even small doses of cannabis, for example. So larger quantities can lead to distorted perception, confusion, restlessness, anxiety and panic, decreased reaction time and paranoia. So the same amount of drug won't affect us affect all of us exactly the same way. So hence it can be a little complicated. It's a not necessarily an easy way of connecting an amount of drugs to the effect of a person's coordination and decision making. And that's why I guess, medical practitioners, doctors, have such a big role in either the testing program or the monitoring program, or even the rehab programs. So so as the screen says, certainly we expect people to be aware of behaviour changes, and I said this is, there's a shared responsibility amongst a lot of people, not just workers and team members, but also supervisors and managers, and always discuss with the doctor is a very important part of this. So alcohol and other drug use in Australia. So these results came out of a somewhat recent survey, and various surveys come out over time. The exact numbers are not that important. It's more that it's the relative use or the possibility of use in the community. And certainly one community is probably different to another community across Australia. And these numbers are averages right across Australia. So you've got nearly a third of people have used cannabis at some time in their life. 10% have used it in the last 12 months. Nearly 10% use some form of illicit drug in their life, and a similar number during the past 12 months. And then even another strangely smaller percent have used prescription drugs for non-medical purposes, and thankfully only a lesser number have used it during the past 12 months. So let's just go into a polling question here. Have any incidents happened on your work site in which it was suspected that workers were affected by drugs?
So I'll show those results now, Gary.
All right, so of our 23 groups of people who've logged in, I don't really know how many have actually answered the poll, but we've got 69% have no knowledge of any incidents happening on your worksite that was suspected to do with drugs, but there is 31%, so that's a reasonably high number, and I guess hence the interest in today's session. So we're just going back to the slides. Thanks, Steph. So yeah, so effects in the workplace. So let's just summarise that again. So alcohol and other drug use has potential negative consequences. Nothing new in that statement. Drug effects vary depending on the individual, the environmental and drug-related factors. Problems are not restricted to the relatively small number of dependent users. Studies have shown that infrequent and moderate users contribute to a large proportion of alcohol and other drug problems in the workplace. So that's the findings of some recent studies. So let's just move to the relevance of alcohol and drug screening in the workplace. in the workforce. So another study there, 2004, 2005, estimated a cost of 55 billion in direct and indirect costs to the Australian economy. This is the use of alcohol or the effects of alcohol and drug use in the workplace. And they estimate there was a factor of 10% of workplace deaths and 25% of workplace accidents. So quite high numbers that have triggered many companies to aim to do something about it up to this point in time. So misuse of alcohol and drugs is associated with absenteeism, turnover, decreased output and performance. So once again, not an earth-shattering statement, and can be the trigger for other forms of employer liability and litigation. Example, sexual harassment claims, people not quite behaving as they should, and end up in court and employer. So once again, just to reinforce, this is the evidence that that companies, offices, as I mentioned before, need to have appropriate systems and procedures and testing programs in place. So we've started off with the fitness for work, then leading into the legal requirements for duty of care for both workers and supervisors and managers. Now, the key principles of individual organisations' drug and alcohol policies. So the aims, the honourable aims, is to improve safety, to improve productivity, to reduce defects and problems, and to help employees overcome or modify, their patterns of use of such substances. Now the trick is how the implementation of such policies can be seen, so it's not like just catching people out. So it's a fine line between the noble and quite correct aims of certainly improving workplace safety and helping people go home fit and well at the end of each and every day, versus people just thinking it's a way to catch them out. And certainly the companies I've seen with testing systems, certainly the mining industry, I think, as I mentioned earlier in my lead-in, with the breath tests that everybody has to adhere to on entry onto site each shift, heavy industry, and also transportation industries. Now you notice in those three, mining, heavy industry and transportation, so this is where the high risks are. So incorrect decisions, poor decisions by people that are affected by drug alcohol can have drastic effects on a large number of other people in these industries. So principles of good practice and testing obligations for both the companies and testers. So it's one thing to have a policy in place. Generally, testing will be required, and principles of good practice here, as you see on your screen: privacy, confidentiality, meeting duties of care, provision of information, fairness, etc., etc. Now so just the provision of information. So part of that would be actually, just letting workers know what drugs are being tested for. I've mentioned some of these earlier, but opiates, example, Panadine Fort, which all of us can get from the local chemist. So the codeine that's in Panadine Fort, so it's transformed into morphine in the human body. So hence it's one of the drugs that's opiates is the general term that they test for. Amphetamines, so the Sudafed type flu and cold tablets fit into the description called amphetamines. antidepressants, so Xanax. So all these medications are easily and probably quite widely used across the community. THC or marijuana. THC is the specific ingredient in marijuana, but sorry, don't ask me a question about what THC stands for. I'm told that's just it's one of these long chemical names. And then the fifth one is methamphetamines. So this is ice, and we've heard about ice recently in the media. Some people using the term being an epidemic, and other people are trying to perhaps suggest it's not that bad. But certainly I think most people agree it's increasing, and the tests for such things and the effects of all these are the issues that companies and back to that list I had earlier, so all those people who have a shared responsibility are generally having to deal with the effects of illicit drug use, perhaps more over greater use of medical drugs that are prescribed through chemists, and some people decide to take more than they prescribed, and then can end up with poor performance, and hence maybe being tested while at work. Now this afternoon is certainly all about work, but we quite often hear about testing for drugs in the sporting arena, and it's a little it's quite similar. You know, there needs to be a testing program. It needs to be, as this slide says, confidentiality, provision of information so people know what's being tested for, as I said, so fairness, gender and cultural sensitivity, and certainly communication around, I guess, the policy in the first place, the style of testing. Some companies, certainly that I've had dealings with, have sometimes they have just ad hoc testing for drugs. Quite often they'll have a program or a policy that says if there's a certain incident, whether it be equipment damage or a work health and safety incident where someone's injured at work, there's an automatic test for drugs and alcohol, and there's not necessarily one type of policy and testing regime that's required by all companies, but it's almost a case-by-case basis. And I mentioned the I guess the industries that I am aware of that already have such testing programs in places, the mining industries, heavy industry, and transportation. So in your industries, if you take a risk-based approach, if you're considering taking issues to a work health and safety committee, discussing maybe management is considering bringing in these policies. So if you have it on a risk-based approach, it makes more sense. It sort of makes more scientific. You've got a basis for it as to what the particular activity is, or the potential outcome of poor decisions based on people being affected by drugs or alcohol. So a drug and alcohol policy. So implementation of a structured drug and alcohol program within the organisation and continued monitoring of the policy. So these are the details that need to be in the policy. Consequences of non-negative results. So non-negative is I guess it's a scientific term that they don't use the word positive because sometimes the results, I guess they need to protect themselves as to whether it's um, uh, the drug is absolutely detected, and hence they end up with terms called non-negative and or instead of positive results. And certainly policies I've seen is that it's not as if one strike and you're out, so to speak. It's to attempt to try to help employees. It's a case of, having tests available for them at the entrance to a work site, so and help them make a decision whether they should be at work or not. But even when they're found out for the first time, it can be a trigger to get them into a program to actually help them overcome it. So that's the policy needs to have details of the consequences and the process between I guess testing and rehabilitation and coming back to work. So education of the effects and long-term usage of drugs and abuse. So another thing that it's not just the testing, but it's education needs to be a part of a company's policy, to help employees and workers generally understand what can happen, both affecting to them if they're affected by the drugs, or even if they're tested and found to be non-negative. Ongoing reinforcement of the organisation's drug and alcohol policy. So that needs to be spelt out. And then most companies have an employee assistance program where a counselling type company provides a service for the workers for companies. So if they feel that this is not just for drug and alcohol issues, they have the employee assistance program generally has a number of free sessions for workers to take advantage of, and they can get an independent person and talk to them confidentially about issues, whether it's family issues or whatever it is that may be affecting them when they go to work. Okay, so under an organisation's drug testing policy, so usually anyone within the organisation can be tested, and certainly in some organisations I've worked in that have been managers that have gone out of their way to put up their hand when they've been involved in some incident and sort of lead the way of going and being tested. So those working in dangerous at-risk industries or operating equipment and machinery are often subject to random workplace testing. And so there it is again, the dangerous and at-risk industries operating equipment and machinery, where the link is that the consequences of poor decisions can be quite horrific. And causal testing, so that's what I described before. If there's an incident of, and I guess this is where the company's policy needs to determine what type of incident requires the person or the people involved to be sent immediately for drug alcohol testing. So the key messages, if I can go over those again for you. So studies have shown that people in the workforce are more likely to have consumed alcohol or illicit drugs in the past 12 months than people who are not in the workforce. I guess the explanation behind that is that I guess people who are in the workforce are earning more money and have more spare cash, so to speak, available to actually purchase the alcohol and the drugs in the first place. Also, contrary to popular opinion, the greater costs to employers do not arise through the behaviour and habits of alcohol and drug-dependent workers, but through the greater number of moderate drinkers when they occasionally or infrequently drink to excess or infrequently use illicit drugs. So the impairment that comes from both acute and chronic symptoms of alcohol and illicit drug use can lead to occupational health and safety issues for both workers who consume these products and other people that they work with. Now, considering the length of time that people spend at work, the workplace is ideally situated to change attitudes and behaviour in regards to alcohol and other drug use. And I guess some people will be thinking, gee, we've got so many things that we've got to educate our workers on. And I guess that's it's almost a fact of life currently in Australia, where I guess we're trying to improve people's work habits in lots of areas, and certainly alcohol and drug use is just one of those. So lastly, in terms of key messages, a workplace policy on alcohol and drug use should be developed in consultation with all members of the workplace, apply equally to all levels, clearly state what is acceptable behaviour, and clearly state the consequences of any unacceptable behaviour, and be clearly communicated to all members of the workforce. So yeah, so that's a summary of the I guess key messages. So let's go to another polling question. Does your company have an alcohol drug testing policy or procedure?
So I'll close that poll, Gary, and
Okay.
share the results.
Alrighty, so we've got 6% of people say that your company has a alcohol and drugs testing policy, but it's not effective. About a third people say that there is a policy and it is effective, but a very big number, 61%, feel that there's you just don't have an alcohol and drugs testing policy and procedure. So certainly there's would appear to be some work to be done in those companies. Steph, has there been any questions come in?
Yeah, so the first question is, and you've probably already covered this, but I guess it probably comes to whether a person can refuse an alcohol and drug test, and also what right does, I guess, the person in charge have to ask for an alcohol and drug test?
Yes, and I guess the answer is in the company's policy and procedure. So that's where it needs to be clearly stated who has rights and responsibilities on what occasions testing can be done, what happens if a person refuses. All that needs to be spelled out in the procedure, and the procedure needs to be created in consultation with workers, with unions, and especially with medical people who understand, I guess, what a non-negative test means for a particular drug versus another one. So it can be quite complicated, but the answer has to be in the policy and the procedure that's documented and well communicated across the work site. And I guess the reason they have to do it or they're required to do it, is their duty of care under a legal framework. Because if an incident happens and it got investigated and found that drug and alcohol use was somewhat reasonably known in the workplace, but the employer had done nothing about it, then they can be held responsible in a court of law for not putting a system in place in the first place.
Okay, thanks, Gary. A question has come in regarding, I guess, in regards to the industries that you did mention. Question is, why is the health industry any less at risk than any industry? You are responsible for people, not just inanimate objects.
The health industry. Sorry, can you just run that by me again, please?
Yes, so the question or the comment is, why is the health industry any less at risk than industry? You are responsible for people, not just inanimate objects.
Okay, I'm with you now. So, in other words, the health industry doesn't appear to have, I haven't mentioned them in my list of industries, and that's because I haven't actually seen the health industry have these policies in place, but that's just me. The other part of your question I'm hearing is, why shouldn't they have one in? Well, no, I agree with you. And if the health and safety committee, the safety officers, the managers in the health industry, if they have a look at their risks and have a look at potential consequences, they may well decide to have similar policies as well. So effectively, I agree. And the basis of it is, do the risk assessment. What's the possible outcome of inappropriate behaviour, incorrect decisions being made, and hence what can be done to reduce that possibility. And certainly education, testing, certainly are all ways that a responsible company in 2015 can implement to provide a reasonably practicable lowered level of risk. So good question.
Thanks, Gary. Just in this question refers to, I guess, the list of alcohol and drugs that that you referred to. The question's, I guess, asking why tobacco wasn't on the list.
Tobacco. So you're quickly getting me into perhaps an area that I'm not qualified in. I can only guess that tobacco doesn't have the short-term effects that the drugs have that are on my list. Certainly tobacco has many long-term effects, but I stand to be corrected on that. I'm certainly not a doctor, but that's my estimate of why tobacco isn't on the list.
Thanks, Gary. Another question, can a company self-manage random testing, or does it have to be undertaken by an external party?
Once again, I think you're catching me out on my thorough knowledge of this topic. I think, yeah, I think my honest answer is I'm not sure. It's just wiser to have it by an independent party, so there's no corruption, so to speak, in the process. But I've not read or seen anything where it has to be external. I think it's just wiser to have it that way.
All right, thanks, Gary. Question, unions are resisting the introduction of random testing in our industry, which is local government. Do you have any suggestions for addressing this level of resistance?
It's an interesting concept, isn't it? Unions. I guess my strategy would be unions listen to their rank and file people, continue with the education program, continuing educating people the possible effects, the likely effects, um, uh, use examples from similar industry, perhaps if there's known incidents from drug or alcohol related or associated with incidents, use that. I'd go down the education path and apart from directly talking with the unions, but also continue talking to their members and use HSRs. If you've got HSRs in your system that are trained in risk assessing, incident investigations, that are the link between the workers and management, use them as part of your communication process.
Thank you, Gary. And just reminding people, there is still time to submit questions before the end of this afternoon's webinar. Another question that's come through, we have a drug and alcohol policy for random testing, but we do not say what happens if a person refuses to attend the tester. Does that mean they can refuse without consequence?
So so first of all, I would say from experience, it's very unwise to have no consequences, but it all needs to be spelled out in the procedure. So yes, I would say it's very unwise not to have consequences.
Thank you, Gary. Another question, from your experience within industry, what would you advise as tolerance level of alcohol allowed? For example, zero tolerance?
I have to admit that this one's out of my area of expertise. This is back to medical people explaining what the I guess what the effect is of different levels and the percent that's found in the blood, and I guess taken on a risk approach to develop the procedure would be my advice.
All right, thank you, Gary. Another question that's come in, how do I know how my workplace will handle personal medical information?
Good question. So once again, it depends on the company policy and procedure. So the policy and procedure is the first step to ensuring that personal medical information is kept confidential. And generally, it's that information would go to the supervisor and the works doctor. Is my experience as to how far that information is distributed, and maybe even the supervisor would get access to a limited amount of that information, but that's an example of what needs to be in the company procedure and policy.
Okay, thanks. Another question that's come in, overseas immigrants or migrants appear to treat or use drugs differently or possibly more regularly. How would you approach that situation?
Yes, so this is, I guess, a more and more relevant question in today's society when we're getting people from Syria. I'm not suggesting I know anything about people's history of taking drugs in Syria, but certainly immigrants. So once again, it's the systems that we've got in place for work health and safety, so that there's the selection system in the process of for the process of selecting people, the recruitment process, checking whether they're actually fit for work. Then there's the induction process. So once people have passed the recruitment process, there's the induction and the training system, where I guess expectations and requirements on people are clearly explained and discussed, and then you've got the ongoing supervision, performance management by supervisors and managers. That is I guess the ongoing system that's required to or that we're relying on to, I guess, explain ultimately these systems. We need to explain to the people um, and link the possible effects to work health and safety incidents in the workplace, and the effect on both them and their workmates.
Thank you, Gary. A question: can you um, give us the difference or the differences between, I guess, saliva testing and urine testing?
Yeah. So the as I understand it, there's a bit of debate um, in the in the workplace, so to speak, as to uh, which tests are better or should be used. Once again, it's a little bit out of my realm of expertise, but certainly saliva is less invasive. But urine testing is likely to be um, have less false positives. If you take my, so it's, I describe it as being more accurate, but I'm told the correct terminology is less likely to be false positives, and it's also the urine testing is cheaper. But having said that, technology is constantly improving, and there's constantly better tests being uh, developed, designed, so that invasiveness and false positives will become less and less a problem as better tests come in.
All right, and just a last couple of questions. Can a policy have two tolerance levels? For example, manufacturing zero tolerance, and for example, admin 0.05. Would that be seen as fair?
Well, I guess I've got to go back to the risk assessment, getting the medical advice as to the effects of 0.05, was it? Was that
Yes,
the level given, Steph? Yep.
yes.
Um, yes, I'd go back to the risk assessment. What are possible outcomes of 0.05 versus zero? Hence, and then what are the, in terms of outcomes, in terms of effects of behaviour, decision making, etc. And then what are the effects? What are the possible effects in the environment? And I guess that's the basis of the question. And this is where some companies want to do as much as they possibly can to reduce the likelihood of incidents. Hence, they go for the zero tolerance. Um, and yeah, as opposed to other companies that perhaps take a little bit, go to a different standard. But that'd be the reasoning, risk assessment, and then where does the company want to be in terms of being a leader in tolerance on these levels.
All right, and final question for this afternoon. What are suitable consequences for employees who have non-negative results?
Suitable consequences. So what I've seen, I don't classify myself as an expert here, but I've certainly seen a suitable consequence is um, having an approved or sort of a discussion about, how did they get into that circumstance, um, getting onto a suitable program. It really depends on, I guess, the person's um, willingness to be open and honest about how they've ended up in that circumstance. But certainly not coming back to work until there's a suitable follow-up program, in general terms, is what I've seen.
And thank you very much, Gary, for this afternoon's presentation, Work-Related Alcohol and Drug Use, a Fit for Work Issue. And thank you as well to everyone for attending this afternoon's webinar. Again, if you do have any further questions, you're more than welcome to contact IPM Safety for any further information. And also, once you do leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. So again, we do appreciate you completing that survey and providing us with your feedback and your comments. And again, we do have webinars running again tomorrow during WorkSafe month, and the month finishes on the 30th of October. So do head to the WorkSafe Tasmania website, have a look at the program of events, and do register for further activities that we do have coming up. So, on behalf of WorkSafe Tasmania and our presenter today, Gary Lebson from IPM Safety, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of the day, and I hope it's a safe and healthy one. Thank you, and thanks, Gary.